Arnold Hollow Cave Incident. On May 5, 1997, 4 explorers prepared to explore Arnold Hollow Cave. Dell Lancaster, her sister Diane, family friend Phyllis Nelson, and cave owner John Nelson entered the cave at 9 a.m. John had been excited about this trip for weeks. Deep inside his cave, about 400 yards from the entrance, was a tight passage. Beyond that narrow crawl, John believed there was a magnificent room that no human had ever seen. As they approached the tight spot, the passage narrowed until it became a crawl space. Dell went first, Diane followed, then Phyllis. Each woman worked her way through the tight space. John Nelson stood at the entrance to the crawl, studying the opening. John found the tight space particularly challenging because of his size. Today, he had a different plan. Instead of forcing himself through the narrow opening, John decided to make some changes. He wanted to enlarge the crawl space to make passage easier. John began working with his tools. He chipped away at the ceiling and hammered on some loose rocks. Each strike seemed to bring him closer to creating a more manageable passage. Then everything went wrong in an instant. The hammering had loosened more rock than John realized. The cave's delicate balance suddenly shifted. A deep rumble filled the air, followed by the sound of falling stone. Rocks tumbled down, filling the passage with debris and blocking the opening completely. The 3 women on the other side of the collapse found themselves trapped underground. One moment they were waiting in the larger room, and the next they had no way out. On the other side of the collapse, John Nelson stared at the blocked passage in horror. 3 people were trapped because of his actions. For the next hour, John worked frantically to clear the blockage, but the pile of rock remained unmoved. The passage was completely sealed. Finally, John accepted that he couldn't handle this alone. He needed help fast. John made his way out of the cave as quickly as possible. The moment John emerged from the cave, he began making emergency calls. Local rescue services responded immediately. The rescue team examined the collapse area. They found that the collapse had created a small gap that allowed communication with the trapped women. The women trapped beyond the collapse were in a cramped space. Dell, Diane, and Phyllis were squeezed into a space barely large enough for 3 people. They had to remain pressed against each other. They couldn't sit or lie down comfortably. The rescue team decided not to clear the collapse until they had properly supported the passage. Moving rocks without proper support could cause the entire area to collapse further. Through the small gap in the debris, rescuers passed essential supplies to the women: food, water, and warm clothing. These supplies helped prevent hypothermia and maintain the women's strength. The mine workers joined the rescue team in installing proper support in the passage. The rescue team worked steadily. As evening approached, the rescue team felt confident enough to begin moving rocks. With the passage properly supported, they started clearing the collapse. As the clock approached 8:30 p.m., more than 11 hours after the collapse, the rescue team finally broke through. The passage was open again, creating a route to freedom. Dell, Diane, and Phyllis emerged from the cave in remarkably good spirits. Lava Tube Cave Incident. On April 24, 2001, Margaret Chen was walking with her 2 golden retriever puppies on the Big Island of Hawaii. The puppies were named Max and Luna and were 6 months old. Margaret had walked this path many times before. The area had lava tubes, underground tunnels formed by old lava flows. The puppies were playing and running around. As they reached the halfway point of their walk, the puppies suddenly ran away. There was no warning. One moment they were walking beside her, the next they were racing away. Margaret called after them, but they disappeared behind a ridge of volcanic rock. At first, Margaret wasn't worried because the puppies often wandered off for a few minutes. But as she followed their path and called their names, she couldn't find them. Minutes turned into an hour. Margaret's calling became more urgent. She climbed over rock formations she had never explored before. As darkness began to fall, real fear crept into her heart. She had only a small flashlight. Then she heard faint whimpering coming from below, somewhere beneath her feet. Margaret followed the sound, moving carefully across the uneven surface. The whimpering led her to a section with holes and pits. Margaret moved from hole to hole, calling down into the darkness. One hole was different. When she called into it, her voice echoed strangely. She aimed her flashlight down into the opening. About 15 feet down, she could see 2 small golden shapes huddled together on a ledge. Max and Luna were alive, but they were trapped. The lava tube opening was only about 2 feet wide, too narrow for Margaret to fit through. They were scared and unable to climb back up the smooth walls. Margaret's heart broke as she looked down at them. She called 911, but her cell phone had no signal. She tried lowering her belt down to them, but it wasn't long enough. Margaret refused to leave them. She lay on her stomach next to the opening, talking to them in soothing tones. Margaret made a decision that would cost her everything. She positioned herself over the opening, feet first, and began to lower herself down. The walls were smoother than they looked, and the opening was narrower than she estimated. Margaret slipped and fell headfirst into the lava tube. Margaret became wedged in the tube upside down. Her waist and upper body were pinned by the narrow walls. She was now close enough to touch her puppies, but she couldn't help them. She couldn't help herself. Hours passed, and Margaret's calls for help grew weaker. The next morning, a few hikers found them and called for help. Margaret was barely conscious. The rescue team arrived quickly. Her face was dark red from blood pooling in her head. She could barely speak. Being trapped upside down was slowly killing her. The blood pooling in her head was putting pressure on her brain and heart. Hours passed as they worked desperately to free her, but Margaret's body body was shutting down. Margaret touched the puppy's noses one last time. She kept saying, "Take care of my dogs." The rescue workers never stopped trying, but Margaret's body couldn't survive being trapped upside down for so long. Margaret died trying to save her puppies. The rescue workers eventually retrieved her body and the two puppies. Puckett Cave Incident. On May 23, 1997, 3 cavers, Elizabeth, Patrick, and James, decided to explore Puckett Cave in Alabama. Both James and Patrick had been in this cave before and felt confident. The entrance was a 70-foot vertical drop into darkness. One by one, they rigged their ropes and descended carefully into the cave. A second drop of 40 feet took them deeper. After hours of moving through chambers and crawlways, they decided to head back. James led the way. As they reached an area scattered with jagged boulders, James's foot suddenly slipped. He lost his balance and fell. James hit a series of sharp rocks that slammed into his back with brutal force. The impact left him dazed and disoriented. James became wedged into a narrow crevice. His legs were squeezed painfully between rock walls. His back pressed against the rough, cold stone. Even the smallest movement sent bolts of pain through his upper body. James tried to shift, but every attempt left him gasping in pain. The impact made a loud crack that sent chills through Elizabeth and Patrick. They rushed toward him, moving quickly but carefully. When they saw James wedged in the narrow crevice, they considered trying to rescue him themselves. But they realized that even the smallest mistake could worsen his injury. They were afraid he might have a spinal fracture. Elizabeth and Patrick knew they had to get help. Patrick left to find assistance while Elizabeth stayed with James. Patrick navigated his way back, climbing up to the cave entrance. He reached the surface and called for rescue at 8:45 p.m. By 11 p.m., the rescue team arrived at the cave entrance. The rescuers made their way through the narrow paths and crawls. They reached James around 1 a.m. By then, James's condition had worsened. His skin was pale, his face was tight with pain, and his body was shivering violently. The rescue team began the slow process of freeing him. Using crowbars and drills, they slowly started widening the crevice. James groaned with every movement. After a long hour, the passage became wide enough to get him out. Once he was finally freed from the crevice, he was able to stretch his legs slightly. The rescuers realized that the numbness was due to being trapped for so long rather than a major back injury. The rescuers wrapped him in blankets and put him on a stretcher. At 6:40 a.m., after hours of work, James emerged from the cave. James was rushed to a nearby hospital where he was treated for hypothermia. Doctors confirmed he had only bruised his tailbone. Devil's Den Cave Incident. On August 18th, 2 15-year-olds named Tim Smithfield and his twin brother Tom decided to explore a cave. They were excited to explore Devil's Den Cave, something they had been planning for weeks. To get to the cave, they hiked through thick forest. The cave entrance was a big hole in the hillside. Both brothers were excited and not afraid as they went inside. Devil's Den Cave was known for having tight spaces and deep cracks in the rock. As they walked deeper into the cave, their headlamps lit up the darkness. The cave was beautiful in a spooky way. It had smooth stone carved by water over many years. The air got cooler as they went deeper. Then Tim noticed a narrow crack in the rock on the right side. It was only 9 inches wide, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. Tom thought they should stick to the easier parts of the cave, but Tim was curious. Even though Tom warned him to be careful, Tim squeezed into the narrow crack. He wanted to see how far it went. The crack was 20 feet long. As he made his way down, the walls pressed against his body. He had to twist and bend to move deeper into the crack. Suddenly, Tim's foot hit a weak piece of rock at the bottom of the crack, and it slipped. His left leg got jammed tightly between 2 rock faces. His other leg, which was resting on the slippery walls, also slipped. This left him stretched in a painful position, trapped between the rocks. Tim panicked and called out for Tom. His left leg was stuck and his right leg was pulling his lower body down. The pressure on his trapped leg was terrible and pain shot up through his knee and ankle. The walls were too tight for him to move into a better position. Tom heard his brother's cries and rushed to the crack. He looked down from the top, trying to see how to help. The narrow gap made it impossible for him to reach down and pull his brother out. Tom couldn't free him alone. Tom realized this was a serious emergency. He ran out of the cave and sprinted through the forest. By 5:30 in the evening, Tom reached the park's visitor center. 2 experienced rangers, Jeremy Bruce and Tim Scott, grabbed their rescue gear and followed Tom back to the cave right away. When they reached the crack where Tim was stuck, they realized he was trapped much deeper than they had expected. The narrow passage made it hard to even see him clearly. His voice echoed faintly up through the rock, and they could hear the pain in it. The rangers quickly understood that this wasn't just a simple rescue. Tim's foot was jammed tightly, and any wrong move could hurt him more or push him deeper into the crack. Ranger Bruce called for backup, asking for special cave rescue teams to help. By 7:50 in the evening, the cave rescue team had arrived. They made a plan together. The only option was to pull him sideways, but they had to do it very carefully. They set up a pulley system and got ready to pull him up. They encouraged Tim to put it under his arms and around his chest. Tim, who was exhausted and in pain, followed their instructions. As the rescuers began to pull, Tim's body slowly started to rise, inch by inch. Every pull brought terrible pain as his leg fought against the rock, but Tim knew this was his only chance. Finally, his trapped foot came loose. The team gave one final pull, and with a grunt, they freed Tim from the rock's grip. It was 8:20 in the evening when Tim was finally pulled from the crack. His legs were bruised and swollen, but amazingly, he didn't have any serious injuries. Church Cave Incident. In 1980, 5 friends from a cave exploring group went to Church Cave in Kings Canyon National Park in California. Their names were Dave Cowan, Paul Graves, Jack Aspina, Bob Pine, and Eric Popoff. They were experienced cave explorers. The 5 friends started their hike early in the morning. They reached Church Cave around 9:30 in the morning. They used ropes to lower themselves into the first part of the cave. They found themselves in a small chamber where the walls seemed to press in close around them. The cave was very quiet. Then something terrible happened. They heard a deep rumbling sound. The ground under their feet began to shake. A 6.0 earthquake had struck. They held onto the walls as everything around them shook. Dust filled the air, rocks fell from above, and the ceiling made creaking sounds like it might collapse. When the shaking finally stopped, there was a scary silence. Their hearts were beating very fast. They were alive, but they knew they were still in danger. The cave could fall down at any moment. The friends knew they had to get out of the cave immediately. They started climbing back toward the entrance, but just 20 minutes later, another earthquake hit. This one was 5.7 on the earthquake scale. The ground shook again, and rocks from above started falling down. Every shake feels stronger. The group kept moving, trying to reach a part of the cave called the torture chamber. This was a steep, narrow passage they had climbed down earlier, but now they had to climb back up. It was slow, careful work. Jack Aspina was leading the climb when the worst thing happened. Another huge earthquake. Another 6.0 struck. The cave shook violently again. Jack lost his grip on the rocks and fell, hitting the stone walls as he slid back down. He got stuck tightly between 2 big rocks. The rest of the group was also struggling to stay standing as the earthquake shook the cave. Dust and small rocks poured down like a waterfall. Jack was screaming because he was trapped and couldn't move. Below him, the other 4 friends were trying to keep their balance as the cave continued to shake. When the earthquake stopped, they quickly went to help Jack. It took ropes, teamwork, and a lot of effort to pull Jack free from where he was stuck. Jack was hurt and bruised and probably wondering why he had ever entered the cave, but there was no time to rest. They had to keep moving toward the exit. As they got closer to the entrance, the earth kept shaking with more aftershocks. Every time there was another shake, they had to stop moving and hug the cold rock walls, hoping the cave wouldn't collapse on top of them. Every step they took was dangerous. They didn't know if the next earthquake would be their last. Finally, after what felt like a nightmare, they saw daylight. As they exited, the earth gave one last shake, a 5.7 aftershock that sent more rocks tumbling behind them. They had made it out just in time. Red Knolls Cave Incident. On December 21st, 1997, 5 friends, Brandon Silverhorn, Christopher Reed, Gus Hansen, John Salazar, and Jeremy Platt, decided to go to a place called the Safford Shafts, also known as Red Knolls. It was full of deep holes in the ground, 40 to 60 feet deep. They arrived around 9 at night with gasoline and a very dangerous idea. They found a narrow crack in the rock. They poured about 4 gallons of gasoline down the crack. Then they lit a rag soaked in gas and threw it into the hole. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then something terrible happened. The ground literally exploded. Fire and rocks shot up into the air like a volcano. The crack became much bigger instantly, turning into a huge hole. The blast was so powerful that it threw 4 of the young men backward. But Brandon Silverhorn wasn't so lucky. Brandon was standing too close to the edge looking down when the explosion happened. He rolled over and fell into the pit, dropping straight down 40 feet into a narrow crack in the rock. The landing was terrible. Brandon's leg hit first and broke with a loud snap. He slid further into the crack, and his body twisted in an unnatural way. Rocks and dirt fell down after him, trapping him in place. Then the worst part happened. A huge piece of rock, 3 feet by 5 feet, slid down and landed on top of everything, burying Brandon like he was in a grave. Brandon was wedged in the crack with his body twisted at a bad angle. His head was pushed sideways against the rock wall. His broken leg was in terrible pain, and the weight of everything was crushing his body, making it hard to breathe. Dust filled the air, making it hard for him to call for help. The other 4 friends were in shock and panic. They shouted Brandon's name, but got no answer. They knew they couldn't rescue him by themselves, so they ran to their car and raced back to town to get help. Rescue workers arrived within an hour. When they saw what had happened, they knew this would be a long and dangerous rescue. The first thing they noticed was the huge rock slab covering Brandon. Hours had passed, and the rescuers weren't sure if Brandon could still be alive. They knew they had to work fast. Brandon's injuries, the cold, and the weight of the debris could kill him if they didn't reach him soon. The The first job was to remove the massive rock slab. The rescuers began chipping away at its edges to loosen it. Once they had enough room, they set up a pulley system. It took 6 men pulling with all their strength to lift the slab inch by inch. Finally, with one last big pull, they moved it out of the way. With the slab removed, the digging began. Rescuers carefully worked around Brandon, removing rocks and dirt by hand. Brandon's body was numb with cold, and his broken leg hurt terribly with every small movement. The dust had filled his throat, making it impossible to cry out. Finally, after hours of careful work, the rescuers reached Brandon. They were amazed to find him alive. They put a harness around his body, making sure his broken leg was supported. The rescuers worked slowly, pulling him out bit by bit to avoid making his injuries worse. At last, after nearly 12 terrible hours, Brandon was lifted out of the pit. He was rushed to the hospital. It was a miracle that he survived.